That's the way to go about it, said the captain. Now then, Arden, what do you say to the first question, yes or no? I really can't say anything, replied Arden. In the presence of such distinguished scientists, I'm only a listener, a mere looker-on in Vienna, as the divine Williams has it. However, for the sake of argument, suppose I reply in the affirmative, and say that the moon is inhabitable. If you do, I shall most unhesitatingly contradict you, said Barbicane, feeling just then in splendid humour for carrying on an argument, not, of course, for the sake of contradicting or conquering or crushing or showing off, or for any other vulgar weakness of lower minds, but for the noble and indeed the only motive that should impel a philosopher, that of enlightening and convincing. In taking the negative side, however, or saying that the moon is not inhabitable, I shall not be satisfied with merely negative arguments. Many words, however, are not required. Look at her present condition. Her atmosphere dwindled away to the lowest ebb, her seas dried up or very nearly so, her waters reduced to next to nothing, her vegetation, if existing at all, existing only on the scantiest scale, her transitions from intense heat to intense cold, as we ourselves can testify, sudden in the extreme, her nights and her days each nearly 360 hours long, with all this positively against her, and nothing at all that we know of positively for her, I have very little hesitation in saying that the moon appears to me to be absolutely uninhabitable. She seems to me not only unpropitious to the development of the animal kingdom, but actually incapable of sustaining life at all, that is, in the sense that we usually attach to such a term. That saving clause is well introduced, friend Barbicane, said 1000 Nicholl, who, seeing no chance of demolishing Arden, had not yet made up his mind as to having another little bout with the president. For surely, you would not venture to assert that the moon is uninhabitable by a race of beings having an organization different from ours. That question too, Captain, replied Barbicane, though a much more difficult one, I shall try to answer. First, however, let us see, Captain, if we agree on some fundamental points. How do we detect the existence of life? Is it not by movement? Is not motion its result, no matter what may be its organization? Well, said the captain in a drawling way, I guess we may grant that. Then, dear friends, resumed Barbicane, I must remind you that, though we have had the privilege of observing the lunar continents at a distance of not more than 1/3 of a mile, we have never yet caught sight of the first thing moving on her surface. The presence of humanity, even of the lowest type, would have revealed itself in some form or other, by boundaries, by buildings, even by ruins. Now what have we seen? Everywhere and always the geological works of nature, nowhere and never the orderly labours of man. Therefore, if any representatives of animal life exist in the moon, they must have taken refuge in those bottomless abysses where our eyes were unable to track them. And even this I can't admit. They could not always remain in these cavities. If there is any atmosphere at all in the moon, it must be found in her immense low-lying plains. Over those plains her inhabitants must have often passed, and on those plains they must in some way or other have left some mark, some trace, some vestige of their existence, were it even only a road. But you both know well that nowhere are any such traces visible. Therefore they don't exist. Therefore no lunar inhabitants exist, except of course such a race of beings, if we can imagine any such, as could exist without revealing their existence by movement. That is to say, broke in Arden, to give what he conceived a sharper point to Barbicane's cogent arguments, such a race of beings as could exist without existing. Precisely, said Barbicane, life without movement and no life at all are equivalent expressions. Captain, said Arden, with all the gravity he could assume, have you anything more to say before the moderator of our little debating society gives his opinion on the arguments regarding the question before the House? No more at present, said the captain, biding his time. Then, resumed Arden, rising with much dignity, the Committee on Lunar Explorations, appointed by the Honourable Baltimore Gun Club, solemnly assembled in the projectile belonging to the aforesaid learned and respectable society, having carefully weighed all the arguments advanced on each side of the question, and having also carefully considered all the new facts bearing on the case that have lately come under the personal notice of said committee, unanimously decides negatively on the question now before the chair for investigation, namely, is the moon inhabitable? Barbicane, as chairman of the committee, I empower you to duly record our solemn decision. No, the moon is not inhabitable. Barbicane, opening his notebook, made the proper entry among the minutes of the meeting of December 6th. Now then, gentlemen, continued Arden, if you are ready for the second question, the necessary complement of the first, we may as well approach it at once. I propound it for discussion in the following form. Has the moon ever been inhabited? Captain, the committee would be delighted to hear your remarks on the subject. Gentlemen, began the captain in reply, I had formed my opinion regarding the ancient inhabitability of our satellite long before I ever dreamed of testing my theory by anything like our present journey. I will now add that all our observations so far made have only served to confirm me in my opinion. I now venture to assert, not only with every kind of probability in my favor, but also on what I consider most excellent arguments, that the moon was once inhabited by a race of beings possessing an organization similar to our own, that she once produced animals anatomically resembling our terrestrial animals, and that all these living organizations, human and animal, have had their day, that that day vanished ages and ages ago, and that, consequently, life, extinguished forever, can never again reveal its existence there under any form. Is the chair, asked Arden, to infer from the honourable gentleman's observations that he considers the moon to be a world much older than the earth? Not exactly that, replied the captain without hesitation. I rather mean to say that the moon is a world that grew old more rapidly than the earth, that it came to maturity earlier, that it ripened quicker and was stricken with old age sooner. Owing to the difference of the volumes of the two worlds, the organizing forces of matter must have been comparatively much more violent in the interior of the moon than in the interior of the earth. The present condition of its surface, as we see it lying there beneath us at this moment, places this assertion beyond all possibility of doubt. Wrinkled, pitted, knotted, furrowed, scarred, nothing that we can show on earth resembles it. Moon and earth were called into existence by the Creator probably at the same period of time. In the first stages of their existence, they do not seem to have been anything better than masses of gas, acted upon by various forces and various influences, all of course directed by an omnipotent intelligence. These gases by degrees became liquid, and the liquids grew condensed into solids until solidity could retain its shape. But the two heavenly bodies, though starting at the same time, developed at a very different ratio. Most undoubtedly our globe was still gaseous or at most only liquid, at the period when the moon, already hardened by cooling, began to become inhabitable. Most undoubtedly is good, observed Arden admiringly. At this period, continued the learned captain, an atmosphere surrounded her. The waters, shut in by this gaseous envelope, could no longer evaporate. Under the combined influences of air, water, light, and solar heat as well as internal heat, vegetation began to overspread the continents by this time ready to receive it, and most undoubtedly, incontestably, it was at this epoch that life manifested itself on the lunar surface. I say incontestably advisedly, for nature never exhausts herself in producing useless things, and therefore a world so wonderfully inhabitable must of necessity have had inhabitants. I like of necessity too, said Arden, who could never keep still. I always did, when I felt my arguments to be what you call a little shaky. But, my dear captain, here observed Barbicane, have you taken into consideration some of the peculiarities of our satellite which are decidedly opposed to the development of vegetable and animal existence? Those nights and days, for instance, 354 hours long. I have considered them all, answered the brave captain. Days and nights of such an enormous length would at the present time, I grant, give rise to variations in temperature altogether intolerable to any ordinary organization, but things were quite different in the era alluded to. At that time, the atmosphere enveloped the moon in a gaseous mantle, and the vapors took the shape of clouds. By the screen thus formed by the hand of nature, the heat of the solar rays was tempered and the nocturnal radiation retarded. Light too, as well as heat, could be modified, tempered, and genialized, if I may use the expression, by the air. This produced a healthy counterpoise of forces, which now that the atmosphere has completely disappeared of course exists no longer. Besides, friend Arden, you will excuse me for telling you something new, something that will surprise you. Surprise me, my dear boy, fire away surprising me, cried Arden. I like dearly to be surprised. All I regret is that you scientists have surprised me so much already that I shall never have a good, hearty, genuine surprise again. I am most firmly convinced, continued the captain, hardly waiting for Arden to finish, that at the period of the moon's occupancy by living creatures, her days and nights were by no means 354 hours long. Well, if anything could surprise me, said Arden quickly, such an assertion as that most certainly would. On what does the honourable gentleman base his most firm conviction? We know, replied the captain, that the reason of the moon's present long day and night is the exact equality of the periods of her rotation on her axis and of her revolution around the earth. When she has turned once around the earth, she has turned once around herself. Consequently, her back is turned to the sun during one half of the month, and her face during the other half. Now, I don't believe that this state of things existed at the period referred to. The gentleman does not believe, exclaimed Arden. The chair must be excused for reminding the honourable gentleman that it cannot accept his incredulity as a sound and valid argument. These two movements have certainly equal periods now, why not always? For the simple reason that this equality of periods is due altogether to the influence of terrestrial attraction, replied the ready captain. This attraction at present, I grant, is so great that it actually disables the moon from revolving on herself. Consequently, she must always keep the same face turned towards the earth. But who can assert that this attraction was powerful enough to exert the same influence at the epoch when the earth herself was only a fluid substance? In fact, who can even assert that the moon has always been the earth's satellite? Ah, who indeed? Exclaimed Arden. And who can assert that the moon did not exist long before the earth was called into being at all? In fact, who can assert that the earth itself is not a great piece broken off the moon? Nothing like asking absurd questions. I've often found them passing for the best kind of arguments. Friend Arden, interposed Barbicane, who noticed that the captain was a little too disconcerted to give a ready reply. Friend Arden, I must say you are not quite wrong in showing how certain methods of reasoning, legitimate enough in themselves, may be easily abused by being carried too far. I think, however, that the captain might maintain his position without having recourse to speculations altogether too gigantic for ordinary intellect. By simply admitting the insufficiency of the primordial attraction to preserve a perfect balance between the movements of the lunar rotation and revolution, we can easily see how the nights and days could once succeed each other on the moon exactly as they do at present on the earth. Nothing can be clearer, resumed the brave captain, once more rushing to the charge. Besides, even without this alternation of days and nights, life on the lunar surface was quite possible. Of course it was possible, said Arden. Everything is possible except what contradicts itself. It is possible, too, that every possibility is a fact, therefore it is a fact. However, he added, not wishing to press the captain's weak points too closely, let all these logical niceties pass for the present. Now that you have established the existence of your humanity in the moon, the chair would respectfully ask how it has all so completely disappeared. It disappeared completely thousands, perhaps millions of years ago, replied the unabashed captain. It perished from the physical impossibility of living any longer in a world where the atmosphere had become by degrees too rare to be able to perform its functions as the great resuscitating medium of dependent existences. What took place on the moon is only what is to take place some day or other on the earth, when it is sufficiently cooled off. Cooled off? Yes, replied the captain as confidently, and with as little hesitation as if he was explaining some of the details of his great machine shop in Philadelphia. You see, according as the internal fire near the surface was extinguished, or was withdrawn towards the center, the lunar shell naturally cooled off. The logical consequences, of course, then gradually took place. Extinction of organized beings, and then extinction of vegetation. The atmosphere in the meantime became thinner and thinner, partly drawn off with the water evaporated by the terrestrial attraction, and partly sinking with the solid water into the crust cracks caused by cooling. With the disappearance of air capable of respiration and of water capable of motion, the moon, of course, became uninhabitable. From that day it became the abode of death, as completely as it is at the present moment. That is the fate in store for our earth, in all probability. And when is it to befall us? Just as soon as the crust becomes cold enough to be uninhabitable. Perhaps your philosophership has taken the trouble to calculate how many years it will take our unfortunate terra mater to cool off. Well, I have. And you can rely on your figures. Implicitly. Why not tell it at once then, to a fellow that's dying of impatience to know all about it? Captain, the chair considers you one of the most tantalizing creatures in existence. If you only listen you will hear, replied 1000 Nicholl quietly. By careful observations, extended through a series of many years, men have been able to discover the average loss of temperature endured by the Earth in a century. Taking this as the groundwork of their calculations, they have ascertained that our Earth shall become an uninhabitable planet in about Don't cut her life too short, be merciful, cried Arden in a pleading tone half in earnest. Come, a good long day, your honour, a good long day. The planet that we call the Earth, continued the captain, as grave as a judge, will become uninhabitable to human beings after a lapse of 400,000 years from the present time. Hurrah, cried Arden, much relieved. Vive la science, henceforward what miscreant will persist in saying that the savants are good for nothing, proudly pointing to this calculation, can't they exclaim to all defamers, silence, croakers, our services are invaluable, haven't we insured the earth for 400,000 years? Again I say vive la science. Arden, began the captain with some asperity, the foundations on which science has raised. I'm half converted already, interrupted Arden in a cheery tone. I do really believe that science is not altogether unmitigated humbug, vive. But what has all this to do with the question under discussion? Interrupted Barbicane, desirous to keep his friends from losing their tempers in idle disputation. True, said Arden. The chair, thankful for being called to order, would respectfully remind the House that the question before it is, has the moon been inhabited? Affirmative has been heard. Negative is called on to reply. Mr. Barbicane has the parole. But Mr. Barbicane was unwilling just then to enter too deeply into such an exceedingly difficult subject. The probabilities, he contented himself with saying, would appear to be in favour of the captain's speculations, but we must never forget that they are speculations, nothing more. Not the slightest evidence has yet been produced that the moon is anything else than a dead and useless waste of extinct volcanoes. No signs of cities, no signs of buildings, not even of ruins, none of anything that could be reasonably ascribed to the labours of intelligent creatures. No sign of change of any kind has been established. As for the agreement between the moon's rotation and her revolution, which compels her to keep the same face constantly turned towards the earth, we don't know that it has not existed from the beginning. As for what is called the effect of volcanic agency upon her surface, we don't know that her peculiar blistered appearance may not have been brought about altogether by the bubbling and spitting that blisters molten iron when cooling and contracting. Some close observers have even ventured to account for her craters by saying they were due to pelting showers of meteoric rain. Then again, as to her atmosphere, why should she have lost her atmosphere? Why should it sink into craters? Atmosphere is gas, great in volume, small in matter. Where would there be room for it? Solidified by the intense cold, possibly in the night time, but would not the heat of the long day be great enough to thaw it back again? The same trouble attends the alleged disappearance of the water, swallowed up in the cavernous cracks, it is said. But why are there cracks? Cooling is not always attended by cracking. Water cools without cracking, cannon balls cool without cracking. Too much stress has been laid on the great difference between the nucleus and the crust. It is really impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. In fact, no theory explains satisfactorily anything regarding the present state of the moon's surface. In fact, from the day that Galileo compared her clustering craters to eyes on a peacock's tail, to the present time, we must acknowledge that we know nothing more than we can actually see, not one particle more of the moon's history than our telescopes reveal to our corporal eyes. In the lucid opinion of the honourable and learned gentleman who spoke last, said Arden, the chair is compelled to concur. Therefore, as to the second question before the House for deliberation, has the moon been ever inhabited? The chair gets out of its difficulty, as a Scotch jury does when it has not evidence enough either way, by returning a solemn verdict of not proven. And with this conclusion, said Barbicane, hastily rising, of a subject on which, to tell the truth, we are unable as yet to throw any light worth speaking of, let us be satisfied for the present. Another question of greater moment to us just now is, where are we? It seems to me that we are increasing our distance from the moon very decidedly and very rapidly. It was easy to see that he was quite right in this observation. The projectile, still following a northerly course and therefore approaching the lunar equator, was certainly getting farther and farther from the moon. Even at 30 degrees S, only 10 degrees farther north than the latitude of Tycho, the travellers had considerable difficulty, comparatively, in observing the details of Pitatus, a walled mountain on the south shores of the Mare Nubium. In the sea itself, over which they now floated, they could see very little, but far to the left on the 20th parallel, they could discern the vast crater of Bullialdus, 9,000 feet deep. On the right they had just caught a glimpse of Purbach, a depressed valley almost square in shape with a round crater in the centre, when Arden suddenly cried out, "A railroad!" And sure enough, right under them, a little northeast of Purbach, the travelers easily distinguished a long line, straight and black, really not unlike a railroad cutting through a low, hilly country. This, Barbicane explained, was of course no railway, but a steep cliff, at least 1,000 feet high, casting a very deep shadow, and probably the result of the caving in of the surface on the eastern edge. Then they saw the immense crater of Arzachel, and in its midst a cone mountain shining with dazzling splendor. A little north of this, they could detect the outlines of another crater, Alphonse, at least 70 miles in diameter. Close to it they could easily distinguish the immense crater, or, as some observers call it, ramparted plain Ptolemy, so well known to lunar astronomers, occupying, as it does, such a favorable position near the center of the moon, and having a diameter fully in one direction at least, 120 miles long. The travelers were now in about the same latitude as that at which they had at first approached the moon, and it was here that they began most unquestionably to leave her. They looked and looked, readjusting their glasses, but the details were becoming more and more difficult to catch. The reliefs grew more and more blurred, and the outlines dimmer and dimmer. Even the great mountain profiles began to fade away, the dazzling colors to grow duller, the jet-black shadows grayer, and the general effect mistier. At last the distance had become so great that, of this lunar world so wonderful, so fantastic, so weird, so mysterious, our travelers by degrees lost even the consciousness, and their sensations, lately so vivid, grew fainter and fainter, until finally they resembled those of a man who is suddenly awakened from a peculiarly strange and impressive dream. Chapter 19. In every fight the impossible wins. No matter what we have been accustomed to, it is sad to bid it farewell forever. The glimpse of the moon's wondrous world imparted to Barbicane and his companions had been, like that of the promised land to Moses on Mount Pisgah, only a distant and a dark one. Yet it was with inexpressibly mournful eyes that, silent and thoughtful, they now watched her fading away slowly from their view, the conviction impressing itself deeper and deeper in their souls that, slight as their acquaintance had been, it was never to be renewed again. All doubt on the subject was removed by the position gradually, but decidedly, assumed by the projectile. Its base was turning away slowly and steadily from the moon, and pointing surely and unmistakably towards the earth. Barbicane had been long carefully noticing this modification, but without being able to explain it. That the projectile should withdraw a long distance from the moon and still be her satellite, he could understand, but being her satellite, why not present towards her its heaviest segment, as the moon does towards the earth? That was the point which he could not readily clear up. By carefully noting its path, he thought he could see that the projectile, though now decidedly leaving the moon, still followed a curve exactly analogous to that by which it had approached her. It must therefore be describing a very elongated ellipse, which might possibly extend even to the neutral point where the lunar and terrestrial attractions were mutually overcome. With this surmise of Barbicane's, his companions appeared rather disposed to agree, though, of course, it gave rise to new questions. "Suppose we reach this dead point," asked Ardan, "what then is to become of us?" "Can't tell," was Barbicane's unsatisfactory reply. "But you can form a few hypotheses." "Yes, two." "Let us have them." "The velocity will be either sufficient to carry us past the dead point, or it will not. Sufficient, we shall keep on, just as we are now, gravitating forever around the moon." "Hypothesis number 2 will have at least one point in its favor," interrupted as usual the incorrigible Ardan. "It can't be worse than hypothesis number 1. "Insufficient," continued Barbicane, laying down the law. "We shall rest forever motionless on the dead point of the mutually neutralizing attractions." "A pleasant prospect," observed Ardan, "from the worst possible to no better, isn't it, Barbicane?" "Nothing to say," was Barbicane's only reply. "Have you nothing to say either, Captain?" asked Ardan, beginning to be a little vexed at the apparent apathy of his companions. "Nothing whatever," replied 1000 Nicholl, giving point to his words by a despairing shake of his head. "You don't mean surely that we're going to sit here, like bumps on a log, doing nothing until it will be too late to attempt anything?" "Nothing whatever can be done," said Barbicane gloomily. "It is vain to struggle against the impossible." "Impossible? Where did you get that word? I thought the American schoolboys had cut it out of their dictionaries." "That must have been since my time," said Barbicane, smiling grimly. "It still sticks in a few old copies anyhow," drawled 1000 Nicholl dryly, as he carefully wiped his glasses. "Well, it has no business here," said Arden. "What? A pair of live Yankees and a Frenchman of the 19th century too, recoil before an old-fashioned word that hardly scared our grandfathers. What can we do? Correct the movement that's now running away with us." "Correct it." "Certainly correct it, or modify it, or clap brakes on it, or take some advantage of it that will be in our favor. What matters the exact term so you comprehend me?" "Easy talking. As easy doing." "Doing what, doing how?" "The what and the how is your business, not mine. What kind of an artillery man is he who can't master his bullets? The gunner who cannot command his own gun should be rammed into it head foremost himself, and blown from its mouth. A nice pair of savants you are. There you sit as helpless as a couple of babies after having inveigled me." "Inveigled?" cried Barbicane and 1,000 Nicholl starting to their feet in an instant. "What?" Come, went on Arden, not giving his indignant friends time to utter a syllable. "I don't want any recrimination. I'm not the one to complain. I'll even let up a little if you consider the expression too strong. I'll even withdraw it altogether and assert that the trip delights me, that the projectile is a thing after my own heart, that I was never in better spirits than at the present moment. I don't complain, I only appeal to your own good sense, and call upon you with all my voice to do everything possible, so that we may go somewhere, since it appears we can't get to the moon." "But that's exactly what we want to do ourselves, friend Arden," said Barbicane, endeavoring to give an example of calmness to the impatient 1,000 Nicholl. "The only trouble is that we have not the means to do it." "Can't we modify the projectile's movement?" "No. Nor diminish its velocity?" "No. Not even by lightening it, as a heavily laden ship is lightened, by throwing cargo overboard." "What can we throw overboard? We have no ballast like balloon men." "I should like to know," interrupted 1,000 Nicholl, "what would be the good of throwing anything at all overboard? Anyone with a particle of common sense in his head can see that the lightened projectile should only move the quicker." "Slower, you mean," said Arden. "Quicker, I mean," replied the captain. "Neither quicker nor slower, dear friends," interposed Barbicane, desirous to stop a quarrel. "We are floating, you know, in an absolute void where specific gravity never counts." "Well then, my friends," said Arden in a resigned tone that he evidently endeavored to render calm, "since the worst is come to the worst, there is but one thing left for us to do." "What's that?" said the captain, getting ready to combat some new piece of nonsense. "To take our breakfast," said the Frenchman curtly. It was a resource he had often fallen back on in difficult conjunctures, nor did it fail him now. Though it was not a project that claimed to affect either the velocity or the direction of the projectile, still, as it was eminently practicable, and not only unattended by no inconvenience on the one hand, but evidently fraught with many advantages on the other, it met with decided and instantaneous success. It was rather an early hour for breakfast, 2 o'clock in the morning, yet the meal was keenly relished. Arden served it up in charming style, and crowned the dessert with a few bottles of a wine especially selected for the occasion from his own private stock. It was a Tokay Imperial of 1863, the genuine essence, from Prince Esterhazy's own wine cellar, and the best brain stimulant and brain clearer in the world, as every connoisseur knows. It was near 4 o'clock in the morning when our travellers, now well fortified physically and morally, once more resumed their observations with renewed courage and determination, and with a system of recording really perfect in its arrangements. Around the projectile, they could still see floating most of the objects that had been dropped out of the window. This convinced them that, during their revolution around the moon, they had not passed through any atmosphere. Had anything of the kind been encountered, it would have revealed its presence by its retarding effect on the different objects that now followed close in the wake of the projectile. One or two that were missing had been probably struck and carried off by a fragment of the exploded bolide. Of the Earth nothing as yet could be seen. She was only 1 day old, having been new the previous evening, and 2 days were still to elapse before her crescent would be sufficiently cleared of the solar rays to be capable of performing her ordinary duty of serving as a timepiece for the Selenites. For, as the reflecting reader need hardly be reminded, since she rotates with perfect regularity on her axis, she can make such rotations visible to the Selenites by bringing some particular point on her surface once every 24 hours directly over the same lunar meridian. Towards the moon, the view, though far less distinct, was still almost as dazzling as ever. The radiant Queen of Night still glittered in all her splendor in the midst of the starry host, whose pure white light seemed to borrow only additional purity and silvery whiteness from the gorgeous contrast. On her disk, the seas were already beginning to assume the ashy tint so well known to us on Earth, but the rest of her surface sparkled with all its former radiation, Tycho glowing like a sun in the midst of the general resplendescence. Barbicane attempted in vain to obtain even a tolerable approximation of the velocity at which the projectile was now moving. He had to content himself with the knowledge that it was diminishing at a uniform rate, of which indeed a little reflection on a well-known law of dynamics readily convinced him. He had not much difficulty even in explaining the matter to his friends. Once admitting, said he, the projectile to describe an orbit round the moon, that orbit must of necessity be an ellipse. Every moving body circulating regularly around another describes an ellipse. Science has proved this incontestably. The satellites describe ellipses around the planets around the sun himself describes an ellipse around the unknown star that serves as a pivot for our whole solar system. How can our Baltimore Gun Club projectile then escape the universal law? Now, what is the consequence of this law? If the orbit were a circle, the satellite would always preserve the same distance from its primary, and its velocity should therefore be constant. But the orbit being an ellipse, and the attracting body always occupying one of the foci, the satellite must evidently lie nearer to this focus in one part of its orbit than in another. The Earth, when nearest to the Sun, is in her perihelion, when most distant in her aphelion. The Moon, with regard to the Earth, is similarly in her perigee and her apogee. Analogous expressions denoting the relations of the projectile towards the Moon would be periselene and aposelene. At its aposelene, the projectile's velocity would have reached its minimum, at the periselene, its maximum. As it is to the former point that we are now moving, clearly the velocity must keep on diminishing until that point is reached. Then, if it does not die out altogether, it must spring up again, and even accelerate as it reapproaches the Moon. Now the great trouble is this: if the aposelenitic point should coincide with the point of lunar attraction, our velocity must certainly become nil, and the projectile must remain relatively motionless forever. What do you mean by relatively motionless? Asked 1000 Nicholl, who was carefully studying the situation. I mean, of course, not absolutely motionless, answered Barbicane. Absolute immobility is, as you are well aware, altogether impossible, but motionless with regard to the Earth and the... By Mahomet's jackass, interrupted Arden hastily, I must say we're a precious set of imbeciles. I don't deny it, dear friend, said Barbicane quietly, notwithstanding the unceremonious interruption, but why do you say so just now? Because though we are possessed of the power of retarding the velocity that takes us from the Moon, we have never thought of employing it. What do you mean? Do you forget the rockets? It's a fact, cried 1000 Nicholl. How have we forgotten them? I'm sure I can't tell, answered Barbicane, unless perhaps because we had too many other things to think about. Your thought, my dear friend, is a most happy one, and of course we shall utilize it. When? How soon? At the first favorable opportunity, not sooner. For you can see for yourselves, dear friends, he went on explaining, that with the present obliquity of the projectile with regard to the lunar disk, a discharge of our rockets would be more likely to send us away from the Moon than towards her. Of course, you are both still desirous of reaching the Moon. Most emphatically so. Then by reserving our rockets for the last chance, we may possibly get there after all. In consequence of some force, to me utterly inexplicable, the projectile still seems disposed to turn its base towards the Earth. In fact, it is likely enough that at the neutral point its cone will point vertically to the Moon. That being the moment when its velocity will most probably be nil, it will also be the moment for us to discharge our rockets, and the possibility is that we may force a direct fall on the lunar disk. Good, cried Arden, clapping hands. Why didn't we execute this grand maneuver the first time we reached the neutral point? Asked 1000 Nicholl a little crustily. It would be useless, answered Barbicane. The projectile's velocity at that time, as you no doubt remember, not only did not need rockets, but was actually too great to be affected by them. True, chimed in Arden. A wind of 4 miles an hour is very little use to a steamer going 10. That assertion, cried 1000 Nicholl, I am rather Dear friends, interposed Barbican, his pale face beaming and his clear voice ringing with the new excitement, let us just now waste no time in mere words. We have one more chance, perhaps a great one. Let us not throw it away. We have been on the brink of despair. Beyond it, cried Arden. But I now begin to see a possibility, nay, a very decided probability, of our being able to attain the great end at last. Bravo, cried Ardens. Hurrah, cried 1,000 Nicholl. Yes, my brave boys, cried Barbican as enthusiastically as his companions, all's not over yet by a long shot. What had brought about this great revulsion in the spirits of our bold adventurers? The breakfast, Prince Esterhazy's toquet, the latter most probably. What had become of the resolutions they had discussed so ably and passed so decidedly a few hours before? Was the moon inhabited? No. Was the moon habitable? No. Yet in the face of all this, or rather as coolly as if such subjects had never been alluded to, here were the reckless scientists actually thinking of nothing but how to work heaven and earth in order to get there. One question more remained to be answered before they played their last trump, namely, at what precise moment would the projectile reach the neutral point? To this Barbican had very little trouble in finding an answer, the time spent in proceeding from the South Pole to the dead point being evidently equal to the time previously spent in proceeding from the dead point to the North Pole. To ascertain the former, he had only to calculate the latter. This was easily done, to refer to his notes, to check off the different rates of velocity at which they had readied the different parallels, and to turn these rates into time, required only a very few minutes' careful calculation. The projectile then was to reach the point of neutral attraction at 1 o'clock in the morning of December 8th. At the present time, it was 5 o'clock in the morning of the 7th, therefore, if nothing unforeseen should occur in the meantime, their great and final effort was to be made about 20 hours later. The rockets, so often alluded to as an idea of Arden's and already fully described, had been originally provided to break the violence of the projectile's fall on the lunar surface, but now the dauntless travellers were about to employ them for a purpose precisely the reverse. In any case, having been put in proper order for immediate use, nothing more now remained to be done till the moment should come for firing them off. Now then, friends, said 1,000 Nicholl, rubbing his eyes but hardly able to keep them open, I'm not over fond of talking, but this time I think I may offer a slight proposition. We shall be most happy to entertain it, my dear captain, said Barbican. Arden gazed on the pair. I propose we lie down and take a good nap. Good gracious, protested Arden, what next? We have not had a blessed wink for 40 hours, continued the captain. A little sleep would recuperate us wonderfully. No sleep now, exclaimed Arden. Every man to his taste, said 1,000 Nicholl. Mine at present is certainly to turn in, and suiting the action to the word, he called himself on the sofa, and in a few minutes his deep regular breathing showed his slumber to be as tranquil as an infant's. Barbican looked at him in a kindly way, but only for a very short time. His eyes grew so filmy that he could not keep them open any longer. The captain, he said, may not be without his little faults, but for good practical sense he is worth a shipload like you and me, Arden. By Jove, I'm going to imitate him, and friend Michael, you might do worse. In a short time he was as unconscious as the captain. Arden gazed on the pair for a few minutes, and then began to feel quite lonely. Even his animals were fast asleep. He tried to look out, but observing without having anybody to listen to your observations is dull work. He looked again at the sleeping pair, and then he gave in. It can't be denied, he muttered, slowly nodding his head, that even your practical men sometimes stumble on a good idea. Then curling up his long legs, and folding his arms under his head, his restless brain was soon forming fantastic shapes for itself in the mysterious land of dreams. But his slumbers were too much disturbed to last long. After an uneasy, restless, unrefreshing attempt at repose, he sat up at about 7:30 o'clock, and began stretching himself, when he found his companions already awake and discussing the situation in whispers. The projectile, they were remarking, was still pursuing its way from the moon, and turning its conical point more and more in her direction. This latter phenomenon, though as puzzling as ever, Barbican regarded with decided pleasure. The more directly the conical summit pointed to the moon at the exact moment, the more directly towards her surface would the rockets communicate their reactionary motion. Nearly 17 hours, however, were still to elapse before that moment, that all-important moment would arrive. The time began to drag. The excitement produced by the moon's vicinity had died out. Our travellers, though as daring and as confident as ever, could not help feeling a certain sinking of heart at the approach of the moment for deciding either alternative of their doom in this world, their fall to the moon, or their eternal imprisonment in a changeless orbit. Barbicane and 1000 Nicholl tried to kill time by revising their calculations and putting their notes in order. Arden, by feverishly walking back and forth from window to window, and stopping for a second or two to throw a nervous glance at the cold, silent and impassive moon. Now and then reminiscences of our lower world would flit across their brains. Visions of the famous Gun Club rose up before them the oftenest, with their dear friend Marston always the central figure. What was his bustling, honest, good-natured, impetuous heart at now? Most probably he was standing bravely at his post on the Rocky Mountains, his eye glued to the great telescope, his whole soul peering through its tube. Had he seen the projectile before it vanished behind the moon's north pole? Could he have caught a glimpse of it at its reappearance? If so, could he have concluded it to be the satellite of a satellite? Could Belfast have announced to the world such a startling piece of intelligence? Was that all the earth was ever to know of their great enterprise? What were the speculations of the scientific world upon the subject? Etc., etc. In listless questions and desultory conversation of this kind the day slowly wore away, without the occurrence of any incident whatever to relieve its weary monotony. Midnight arrived. December the 7th was dead. As Arden said, Le sept December est mort, vive le Hewitt. In 1 hour more the neutral point would be reached. At what velocity was the projectile now moving? Barbicane could not exactly tell, but he felt quite certain that no serious error had slipped into his calculations. At 1 o'clock that night, nil the velocity was to be, and nil it would be. Another phenomenon in any case was to mark the arrival of the exact moment. At the dead point, the two attractions, terrestrial and lunar, would again exactly counterbalance each other. For a few seconds, objects would no longer possess the slightest weight. This curious circumstance, which had so much surprised and amused the travellers at its first occurrence, was now to appear again as soon as the conditions should become identical. During these few seconds then would come the moment for striking the decisive blow. They could soon notice the gradual approach of this important instant. Objects began to weigh sensibly lighter. The conical point of the projectile had become almost directly under the center of the lunar surface. This gladdened the hearts of the bold adventurers, the recoil of the rockets losing none of its power by oblique action, the chances pronounced decidedly in their favor. Now, only supposing the projectile's velocity to be absolutely annihilated at the dead point, the slightest force directing it towards the moon would be certain to cause it finally to fall on her surface. Supposing the contrary. Even these brave adventurers had not the courage to suppose the contrary. 5 minutes to 1 o'clock, said 1000 Nicholl, his eyes never quitting his watch. Ready, asked Barbicane of Arden. Aye, aye, sir, was Arden's reply, as he made sure that the electric apparatus to discharge the rockets was in perfect working order. Wait till I give the word, said Barbicane, pulling out his chronometer. The moment was now evidently close at hand. The objects lying around had no weight. The travellers felt their bodies to be as buoyant as a hydrogen balloon. Barbicane let go his chronometer, but it kept its place as firmly in empty space before his eyes as if it had been nailed to the wall. 1 o'clock, cried Barbicane in a solemn tone. Arden instantly touched the discharging key of the little electric battery. A dull, dead, distant report was immediately heard, communicated probably by the vibration of the projectile to the internal air. But Arden saw through the window a long, thin flash, which vanished in a second. At the same moment, the three friends became instantaneously conscious of a slight shock experienced by the projectile. They looked at each other, speechless, breathless, for about as long as it would take you to count 5, the silence so intense that they could easily hear the pulsation of their hearts. Arden was the first to break it. Are we falling or are we not? He asked in a loud whisper. We're not, answered 1000 Nicholl, also hardly speaking above his breath. The base of the projectile is still turned away as far as ever from the moon. Barbicane, who had been looking out of the window, now turned hastily towards his companions. His face frightened them. He was deadly pale, his eyes stared and his lips were painfully contracted. We are falling, he shrieked huskily. Towards the moon, exclaimed his companions. No, was the terrible reply, towards the earth. Sacre, cried Arden, as usually letting off his excitement in French. Fire and fury, cried 1000 Nicholl, completely startled out of his habitual sang-froid. Thunder and lightning, swore the usually serene Barbican, now completely stunned by the blow. I had never expected this. Arden was the first to recover from the deadening shock. His levity came to his relief. First impressions are always right, he muttered philosophically. The moment I set eyes on the confounded thing, it reminded me of the Bastille. It is now proving its likeness to a worse place, easy enough to get into but no redemption out of it.